found the FarrCast, the weekly podcast in its sixth season of helping you understand what's going on in Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Now here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome to the FarrCast. I am Michael Farr. Thanks so much for joining us again this week. It is the third day of August, moving into the second month of the third quarter. Years ticking by, folks. What happened to June and July? They were here a minute ago, I think. Earnings are coming in okay, and a lot of earnings this week for Wall Street. That's big. Fitch downgrades America. That's what it said in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Fitch downgrades America. There's a headline to catch your attention. We still have things going on overseas with Japan and Russia and China. And then we still have to figure out what's going to happen domestically when Congress comes back in September. They're gone. Nobody's in Washington to govern right now. Just in case you were wondering, if things felt a little bit better to you, maybe it's because there's nobody there to muck it up. Actually, almost nobody. President Trump will be in Washington today for another arraignment, one-on-one with the judge. See what happens there. Very interesting new strategy from Trump's lawyer, that he was following the advice of counsel. That's usually a pretty good strategy. We're going to talk to Dan Mahaffee about that. First, we're going to talk to Jim Iuorio about this debt downgrade from Fitch, what it means, if it means anything. And markets didn't seem to like it yesterday, and we've got a 10-year Treasury north of 4.15%. It's been a big drop. Remember, when Treasury prices drop, the yields go higher. So those yields are going higher, and we still have an inverted yield curve. All of this and more this morning as we covered Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Jim Iuorio, our great friend from TJM Institutional Services and the voice of the floor of the Chicago Exchange. Welcome back, Jim.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
We are glad you're here. We always learn so much, Jim. We were talking before we came on the air. Jim's getting ready to do a triathlon with his daughter. Now, how old is your daughter? That is
25.
25. Okay.
I'm not 25, in case you were wondering.
You are slightly more than 2x.
A little older, yes.
Little more than 2x. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And you're trained. So the triathlon, you run how far, you swim how far, and you bike how far?
So I'm not clear. She told me it was Olympic. It's up at Lake Geneva, which is kind of like the furthest northwest suburb of Chicago, but it's in Wisconsin. I think it's Olympic size, which I think is a mile. This is a guess. Mile swim, 25, 26 mile bike, and then a 10K race. That's what I believe to be Olympic size triathlon. But it doesn't matter. I'm going to crash and burn anyway. So it's pointless for me to learn much about it.
Okay. So Jim, that's it. Let's use that as our segue. As Jim plans to crash and burn in his 50s on a triathlon, what are you planning for the markets here that seem to be starting a little rollover, burn, and crash here? Will this actually happen this time, Jim?
See, I believe it will. Thursday, and I've been kind of squawking about this for about a week. Last Thursday, we had the outside day where we had a higher high in the S&P, a lower low. Actually, in all three indexes, NASDAQ and Russell, higher high and a lower low, closed kind of on the beat low. Now, I know that a lot of people who don't trade very often like to hear a fundamental reason why we might correct. And I'm sorry to disappoint. Sometimes it's just market position. Sometimes it's run too far, too fast. I can come up with a lot of reasons why we should go lower, but I can come up with reasons why we should go higher too. But the technicals of it seem to me a close below that 4550 level in the S&P, which we got yesterday, to me indicates it's time for correction. I think that correction will be somewhere between 5 and 10%. Again, I will say this too, and I swear I'm not trying to rub anything in anyone's faces, but when they give you options so cheaply over the last few weeks to hedge your bull position, remind yourself that we should be doing that. A VIX under 14 every time, for the last month, every time we had a sizable up day in the stocks, I'd put on some put protection. So I'm not glad, but I'm not going to do poorly if I'm right about this, and then I'm going to buy those back. And I don't think my downside puts are about down 8 to 10% in the market. I'm not even sure we'll get that far. I do think volatility will explode and skew too, and I'll be able to sell that for profit.
But options are such that if you even start to move in the direction, they start to show profits. And if you get close, they show bigger profits, whether you actually hit those strike prices or not, correct?
Exactly. And so, because that volatility move on the upside and just the regular delta move. But something else that happens when we start to move lower and nobody expects it to happen, something called skew, which means the further out puts to do better than the closer inputs because people are putting on disaster protection. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. That the further out start to skew away. This is a technical discussion, ladies and gentlemen, that we're having, and Jim is talking about technical analysis. And when the markets behave in certain ways and go to new all-time highs, and then we have a new low in the same day, that's a signal. And he's following historical patterns, and he's making short-term decisions based on that volatility and based on these previous patterns, what he's done. And there's a little intuition too in there, isn't there, Jim? I mean, after 30 some odd years of doing this.
There's no doubt about it. You can line me up 20 great technical analysts, and they'll all look at the same pattern slightly differently. Most of the times there's a general consensus, but there's a lot of intuition with it. There's no question about it.
Right. So he's still doing that. He did mention that the fundamental folks still want a fundamental reason, and the fundamental folks could give you a reason. I'm one of those fundamental folks. Stocks got really expensive. They made new all-time highs. They're trading at 20 times or more times earnings while inflation is on the rise. You get inflation at 5% and you don't have a market at 20%. When do you have a 20 times earnings? Markets are at 20 times earnings when inflation is at or below 2% historically. So what we see is an aberration, and we see lower, by and large, we see a lot of lowered earnings estimates that are getting great headlines that say, oh, they beat their estimate. Well, the estimate had been lowered 20%. Great. Good for you. But that's not a huge increase. So it's making new highs. You sell high, you buy low, and there's your fundamental argument. This could still be sold. And that's not a disaster. I don't see a disaster here. The economy.
No, neither way. Yeah, so, the economy's. I think the economy's going into recession by the two, but I don't see a disaster here. I think that a 10% pullback is normal and fine. That brings us to 4,200-ish in the S&Ps. But these kind of things happen all the time. People our age, who every time we start to correct, we wonder, is this the big one again? Because we've seen the big one twice. It doesn't have to be that way, and it's just a normal run-of-the-mill correction, in my opinion.
Okay, normal run-of-the-mill correction. If you get a 10% correction and you've got some cash on the sidelines, maybe that's when you start to put it back in. But for fundamental Fred and Ethel, you're probably out there dollar cost averaging. Money comes out of every check. You put it in your 401k. You make sure it gets invested on those regular monthly withdrawals or quarterly withdrawals. And you do not get cute about your timing of investments. This is way above your pay grade, folks. It should be. You just want to benefit from the overall expansion of the U.S. corporate infrastructure at 7 or 8% a year. And boy, won't you be happy if you can compound at that rate over the long term. So don't get emotional. Don't get cute. Don't get smart. And don't think you're going to really go in, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, and compete against a guy like Jim Iuorio on a trading floor. He will have your lunch before you get it out of the bag. I promise. He'll have your lunch before you get it out of the bag. And he'll see you coming. I mean, I've done it long enough, and I've been seen coming, and I've had my lunch taken from me. It's been a while, but it could still happen again. Jim, the debt was downgraded by Fitch. Do you care?
No, and here, a couple different layers of this, all of which I think are somewhat funny. So Fitch, Moody's, S&Ps, they exist to create this buffer layer between investor and the bond issuance that they might not know much about. And they were put there probably for a reason. They serve a purpose. The U.S. Treasuries are the most analyzed, traded, liquid asset on the planet. They are analyzed every day by the brightest in the world. To think that Fitch could shed some light on the situation, the Fitch, I love when they rate, tier 2 car companies that most people don't know much about, but this is somewhat silly. And there's another element of it too, is that when you're the issuer of the currency like the USA, the Treasury is, they will pay you back. So what they're really saying is perhaps they're going to pay you back in cheaper dollars. So ultimately, it's somewhat a downgrade of the currency. I will say this. You saw what happened yesterday. If I'm right, and it's really a downgrade of the currency, a mild downgrade of the currency, the dollar rallied off.
Currency rallied, yeah.
Right. So at the end of the day, market is saying, oh, Fitch's downgrade could cause headlines that could cause disruptions probably in stock markets. We got to head to a safe asset. So they buy dollars, which literally is the very thing that was downgraded. So the market's not taking it very seriously, except for the fact that others could and start to sell risk.
I always watch currency. I always watch oil. I always watch the 10-year and the 2-year, a couple of other things that I watch every morning. But I am watching the euro more closely than I typically do, because I'm going to Europe for 3 weeks in September. And, I'm looking at that euro back down at the 110. It was about 105 last year when I was in Europe. So it'll be a little more expensive, but 110 is not going to kill me. 110, I can deal with 110. No. $1.10 on the year, I can deal with that. A few years ago, we were $1.30 some odd, $1.40 on that
that's
euro.
Pain.
That's pain. And ladies and gentlemen, when you hear me say that, think about $135 for a dinner for two 3 or 4 years ago. I can buy the same one this year for $110. I can get a nicer bottle of wine. It's not, if you're going to Europe for a couple of weeks, probably not going to affect your budget, but you still care. It's not that you don't care. You still care. So one of the things that, so here was my Fitch problem. My Fitch problem was a year ago, they upgraded U.S. AAA debt. 1 year ago, they upgraded U.S. AAA debt from watch negative to watch stable. Economy is actually stronger right now. Inflation is being tamed. The debt to GDP ratio is actually better now. It's moving in the right direction now. So the timing here for Fitch, I didn't think what they had to say was wrong at all. And I think we should be concerned about the amount of debt. I think we should be concerned about over $31 trillion in debt, to which we're adding every year. I mean, yeah, we should worry about this stuff. Borrowing to spend more money than you make, on and on and on, is not a plan for anybody. I mean,
no. Not only is it not a plan for anyone, Michael, they were borrowing and injecting money into the economy, even though they knew they had a massive inflation problem over the last year and a half. To call it irresponsible stewardship of the currency is an understatement. It's really an abomination. Do you agree?
Not only do I agree, Jim, I think you and I did it, or maybe it was Pocari and I, where I just looked, I said, I said this a year ago, Jim, and I said it 6 months ago. This is when our parents would look at us when we were 17, just absolutely dumbfounded, and say, "What were you thinking? What were you thinking?" And we'd look back at them and go, "We're 17. We didn't think. We don't think at 17." But if you're a member of Congress and you're 55 years old, you are expected to think, and there isn't much evidence that you are.
I challenge you on that. Are they really expected to think?
Yes, I think they are expected to think.
Good. Right.
I think they disappoint as consistently as any. So the other thing is that we saw Yellen and we saw Jamie Dimon come out and go, "Oh, the U.S. is safe, and everybody knows the U.S. is safe, and we shouldn't worry about this." I think we should worry about this. And I think the thing that Fitch said was one of their reasons in downgrading the debt was an erosion of governance, which is used to be that at least you could count on the Republicans to say, "We don't want to spend any more money." And now basically you just hear the Republicans say, "We don't want to spend any more money except on the stuff we want to spend money on."
Yeah. Exactly.
And they'll go with a deficit too, except for the way far right. And so it's now dysfunctional. And I think the risk of a government shutdown in the fall has actually increased.
Right.
Said that on CNBC yesterday. So how do you invest through this, Jim, as we look? I mean, consumer spending's up. We've got jobs that are doing well. Housing's fine. I mean, lots of things in the economy are fine, but
it's okay. Lots of things in the economy are fine, but so this is going to be a long-winded answer, and I apologize for that. I just wrote a Substack about why we're not feeling the effects of the rate hikes in the economy, because inflation's come down quite a bit. I will contend that inflation's come down quite a bit because supply chains have healed, because the government somewhat slowed down injecting money directly into people's accounts. So inflation's come down, but the rate hikes haven't really hit yet, because I think you have to consider the fact that prior to the first rate hike, there was a 5-year period where 10-year yields averaged 1.96%. What I'm getting at is there was plenty of time for businesses, small businesses, people on car loans and mortgages to get into long duration loans. So it's not like back in 2007, 2008, we had a ton of 3-year ARM mortgages, 1-year ARM mortgages that had to recalibrate to higher rates. When higher rates went up, those people had to roll their mortgages. We're not seeing nearly as much of that now. So people are not insulated completely, but a little bit buffered from the effects of higher rates. Now that all that does is extend it. I do believe that a recession is coming. I don't think it's going to be a massive recession. I think that this correction I just talked about might correspond with more signs of recession coming, particularly in labor. It's funny we're talking about today, which is we have the labor numbers on Friday, which is going to be an enormous deal. But anyway, so what do? I'm waiting for my 10% correction, and then I'm going to buy it there. When you talked about people who are passive investors, is it valuable to know that somebody like me thinks there's a 10% correction coming? Yeah, I think so, because I think it makes you understand that even if you are long-term buy and hold, you have to understand that your balance is going to go up and down sometimes. But I don't think that people should be trying to time the market, to your point. Does that all make sense?
That all makes sense. I think the other thing that's important there, Jim, and I think I'm going to end on this because we have gone over time here this morning, but the other thing that really does make sense is that professionals do expect the market to go down. It's not a reason for panic. It's a reason for opportunity. That's the way Buffett thinks. That's the way portfolio managers think. Fred and Ethel typically don't think that way. Fred and Ethel go, oh my God, it's down 10%. It's going to go down more. This is awful. I hate this. I don't want to buy anything. Well, that's not what pros do. So listen when he says it and don't get panicked. We expect the market to go down a bit. We expect still a recession. Okay, maybe we'll be wrong, but what we're not expecting is huge expansionary surpluses going forward. Maybe we're not going to get the recession, but we're telling you, we're seeing things that are not going to be great. They're going to come down a little bit when you see that. It's not a reason to panic, but you live through it. It's never fun, and then it goes back up again. So the message from Iuorio and Farr, stay the course, I think. Jim Iuorio, the voice of the Chicago Exchange. And now you know why, folks. We always learn so much when we talk to Jim. Thank you, Jim, very much.
See you, Michael.
We'll be right back with Dan Mahaffee from the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress when we come back on the FarrCast.
Michael Farr and the FarrCast are proud to support Heroes, Inc. Heroes supports the spouses and children of law enforcement officers and firefighters who gave their lives in the line of duty to the greater Washington, D.C. community. Their singular goal is to honor the supreme sacrifice made by these individuals by caring for their families. Heroes' work begins within 24 hours of the tragic loss and continues indefinitely. We invite you to learn more about Heroes' mission at heroes.org. We hope that you will consider supporting Heroes as they endeavor to honor those who protect us. That's heroes.org. Heroes, here for you, here for good. And now, back to the FarrCast and your host, Michael Farr. Thank you for joining us this week on the FarrCast. Now it's time for political analyst Dan Mahaffee and your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back to the FarrCast. Joining me now, Dan Mahaffee from the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, our senior political analyst on the FarrCast, coming right now down to the end of season 6. We're going to start season 7, September. Can't believe it. Probably end of September when I get back from Europe, to tell you the truth. But Dan, we're so glad you're with us. We learn so much every week you're with us, figuring out what's going on in Washington and around the world. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning and great to be talking with you again.
Yes, indeed. We are glad. We are always glad you're here. So, Dan, the former president is coming back to Washington today, Donald Trump. He is going to be arraigned. He's going to face a judge, a bit one-on-one, and face still some fairly serious charges. Tell us about that.
Yeah, he's returning to Washington for only the second time since January 2021, and this time he will be returning to face this arraignment on this set of charges related to the January 6th insurrection and what the president's role, again, of these charges was in terms of not only perhaps inciting. Now, again, there's not an incitement charge, which should be clear to note in there, but before incitement, what was the conspiracy of these processes with his internal? There's other co-conspirators, though they're not charged. Some argue that's designed to make it a faster trial, but certainly there was a conspiracy to disrupt the handover of power, as Jack Smith alleges, and this is the beginning of the court process here that's going to unfold, and we're going to see now another, again, with the New York cases, the other classified documents cases, and what we believe is a looming Georgia case, yet another set of legal troubles for the former president that frankly seem to be consolidating his support within the Republican primary.
It's strange, throughout sort of this whole political process, from when Donald Trump first said he was going to run for president of the United States, threw his hat in the ring, his whole race against Hillary Clinton, you would see evidence that looked like things, some very strange things, some nuanced things, but the expected reaction was always often 180 degrees from your previous experience and political insight. If it had happened to anyone else, and let's not even pick a specific here. Well, go ahead. Let's just say if a candidate were indicted over and over again, as they were saying they were going to, that would be a bad thing. You would expect their poll numbers to go down if they're getting federal indictments all over the damn place, not to mention the state indictments, and Trump's numbers go up. So, I mean, if he's convicted, I've read reports that saying actually constitutionally, he can carry out the office of the president from prison. That's actually, there's nothing that stops him from running the country from prison if the country elects him from prison. Also read an article, I think it was in the Washington Post yesterday, that said that no candidate has ever had this kind of lead in the polls at this point and not gotten the nomination. Now, maybe it'll happen this time, but it has never happened before. So it looks like, if history is a guide, that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee for president.
Right. The only logic I would have to reply to that is Donald Trump exceeds in the never before category of politics. So the only reason you might want to bet against him is simply because never before has anyone lost such a lead, and simply he would be the first to do it. I don't know at this point, because it is at this point, the way he is responding, and at least among, let's not paint the entire Republican Party with this, because I would say, look at some of the senators who, as I said last week, who just want him to go away, maybe not to prison. They would just like him to disappear into a traditional post-presidency. But we also know that's never going to happen. But there's other Republicans who look, and if you go to National Review, Andrew McCarthy has a great article where he breaks down the numbers of, look, Trump is gaining among his base, of course, as this goes on. They're painting this all as persecution of him. But there's also no other political figure I know where, it's basically those Japanese guys on the islands who think the war is still going on are about the only people who don't have an idea about Donald Trump. Right. The American electorate has an idea of him, and it comes down to, and we look at these poll numbers, they're a snapshot, but are Republicans, there are some that say that 25 to 33% of Republicans would not vote for Trump in the general election. Now, who would they vote for? We don't know. Would they stay home? But look, he is very popular among his base to win the Republican primary, but very poorly situated to do anything in the general election still.
He continues to do well. And then when I talk to members of those who are still great Trump supporters, talk to people anecdotally, they tell me when I ask them about the indictments, they say, another one again? Are they going to do it again? Do they have another indictment? Are they going to keep this up? How long?
So they have that tone, and I think also a lot of and look, they'll point to polls that show Biden and Trump in a dead heat. But that's also a luxury. Those polls are a snapshot of mood now. When this gets into the election, moods are going to change about this. You'll have, again, Biden saying his best political line ever, don't judge me against the almighty, just the alternative. But the American people are, and this is the other thing we see repeatedly in these polls that, again, I don't know whether it's no labels, Mark Cuban, whoever is this fantasy third part. The infrastructure isn't there, but clearly Americans want something else, because we could very well have a situation a year from now where Biden has just performed very poorly during a debate. He could have fallen asleep on the stage, and you have a thrice or quattro indicted Republican candidate, and the American people are going to be stuck between those two choices.
Yeah. And doesn't it look like that's coming again? I mean, doesn't
that seems to be the most likely course we're on right now?
Folks are saying we're hearing more, some Democrats who are starting to stick their heads out of the gopher hole saying, oh no, they're exploring it. They're casting a little bit of chum out in the water, as we fishermen say, see if the fish rise, see if they can get any appeal. Does that go anywhere, or does any of this Manchin third-party candidate go anywhere?
I always say this is I call it the watches too much West Wing syndrome, that that there's some dramatic answer to this that's going to be solved by a new party or a new force, or that there's some kind of maneuver will happen at the convention to replace things. A lot of this is set in infrastructure already. The players there, the staffing. It would be very hard for someone to, of course, run a primary challenge against Biden, again, assuming that there's not a major shift or deleterious moment in his health that we see soon.
There was an article in the Post, Dan, this morning. The article in the Post this morning that said Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, is rising to the moment, is rising to the occasion. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to see that headline in any other paper other than the Washington Post, maybe the New York Times. But it's just nobody.
No, and the one who seems to be
biased, but
right. The two that I would still say are best positioned, Gavin Newsom of California and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, although the latter's inner circle will repeatedly insist that she has no presidential plans at this time.
All right, Dan. So does anything happen from Washington today? The two defenses that I'm hearing now for Trump in this latest arraignment are, number one, he believed that he had actually won and that he was espousing an opinion that he thought was valid, number one. Number two, he acted on the advice of counsel. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've not been involved in anything legal before, one of your strongest defenses and positions is, I have acted on the advice of counsel. On the advice of counsel gets you out of a lot. And he was being counseled by an attorney who was a constitutional expert, suggesting that he raise this issue with Vice President Pence, that he merely asked the question is the part of the defense. Does that do it? Will that work, Dan?
Well, then the third thing I would add just to that I'm hearing is they'll want to try, and this is more procedural, a change of venue, that they don't want this tried in Washington.
Now, that hasn't worked with any of the other January 6th people who wanted a change of venue because they didn't want to be tried in the town where this, atrocity was committed.
Correct. So I think we're going to see the push for that. With regards to the question of his state of mind and whether he believed whether the election was lost, I think the prosecutors are going to try and lay out to that all the various advisors and counts and facts he'd been delivered, as well as the court cases throughout this, throwing out signs of fraud or any of the claims they made. And then, of course, there is the question you say of his legal advice. Reading the tea leaves, obviously they're not named. It is believed that one of the co-conspirators listed is that attorney who was giving him this advice. So that becomes a question of, if the lawyer is part of the conspiracy. I'll leave it up to the legal experts to answer how that might affect that outcome.
Well, that's someone else who can be left on the thorny branches, many of the bodies left on the thorny branches of Donald Trump's wake as he continues to move on. And somebody, so we're back with Joe Biden. He's here this week. I've got a gunboat behind my house right now. The president's house is about a half a mile as the crow flies from mine, maybe not quite. And there are two gunboats behind my house. There's a big battleship right off the coast, right off the beach, not to mention the jets overhead and everything else. So lots of security for the president of the United States here. Is this really a race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at some point?
There's a lot of time for that to happen. I don't understand, though, the sense of, as you say, that's a headline that you would only read in the Washington Post. I don't see Vice President Harris having much momentum outside the Beltway or some other key constituencies to energize a movement against the president, and nor do I think again has the political capital to do so. We forget in 2020 that Joe Biden's advantage was he was the one person who could still handle all the disparate factions within the Democratic Party, and I don't see someone who has that ability coming up behind him so quickly.
What I hear from a lot of people I talk to, and they want to talk to me about Washington. They know I do commentary for TV and everything on Washington, do this on the FarrCast with you. The thing I hear is, it won't be, it just can't be Biden and Trump again. And then they can't elect that man again. And I hear that from both sides. They cannot elect that man again. We cannot have him again. And I always say, John Fetterman is the senator from Pennsylvania. Just don't forget that John Fetterman's the senator from Pennsylvania. He got elected. I mean, Dianne Feinstein's a whole different issue. She's been there since God joined, I think. But, Fetterman's different. They will.
Look, there's plenty of people in this country, and I think that's why the Trump scandals would shock anyone. The Hunter Biden scandals would shock anyone in normal times. But all we seem to really care about in our politics right now is whether someone has the red jersey on or the blue jersey on. And that is the defining characteristic right now. And it's not helping us. And again, I will go back to the proverbial person you're talking to who's asking, who are they electing? I'm sorry to say, in America, there's no they electing. It is us electing. And frankly, too, we're not doing a good enough job asking for real leadership and alternative candidates when we're just going for the party we like instead.
Still loved the line from my friend P.J. O'Rourke. The late P.J. O'Rourke was a very dear friend of mine, who said, "Don't vote. It just encourages the bastards." That really resonates. I wish that there were a solution and not voting. I said years ago, we just ought to outsource the whole thing, even the executive branch, to Goldman Sachs. We get most of their people sooner or later anyway. I think we could just put together a government contract for the office of the president. All right, Dan, final thoughts, anything else on your mind as we look to the next week?
What I'm looking at really is what's the rhetoric on some of these town halls that gives you a good tempo of how things are feeling. We saw how Trump was, responding to this in his own comments, and just basically how the temperature is on this. There's a lot of people saying heated things right now. We hope, and I don't think we see any signs that anything's going to be crazy or dangerous in Washington today. But look, we're dealing with, I hate to say the term, unprecedented territory in some of ways. And I think it's important for our leaders, look, even if we are opposed to what is going on, to let the court of law handle this and not our more intemperate passions.
Dan Mahaffee from the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, our senior political analyst on the FarrCast. Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome, Michael. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we continue to navigate for you best as we're able and bring you experts to cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world. There's lots to talk about every week. And yet, for long-term investors, there's not a lot to do every week. Pay attention, understand the world around you, understand that it's changing. And then as I go to one of my favorite lines from a poem called The Desiderata, and I might get a word wrong here, but stick with me. Whether it's evident to you or not, the universe is probably unfolding as it should. Huh? Do we like that? I love it, just so that you know. Whether it's evident to you or not, the universe is probably unfolding as it should. Think back to our many years talking together, ladies and gentlemen, here on the FarrCast, through presidential races before President Trump was elected, and Hillary Clinton was trying, and we thought that was a done deal for Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States, and all of a sudden at 1 a.m. we find out that Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. And if you were watching, as I was live, because I had to provide commentary live for CNBC at 1 a.m., no one looked quite as surprised as Donald Trump. No one looked quite, and Mike Pence, looked surprised to find out he was going to be the next vice president of the United States. So lots of surprises in politics, lots of major issues, wars in Ukraine, battles in the Middle East, upsets, all acts of terrorism, domestic shootings, all of these things. And yet somehow day to day, America carries on. The business of doing business carries on. And we find our way as Americans together, those who are disciplined, those who are ambitious, those who seek, those who look for growth, and those who are optimistic about the future of our country. Even in our dark hours, we cling to that optimism and that knowledge that we live on fertile soil, and it's self-reliant loam on which we can grow a future, continue to do better, and offer future generations a promise of something better, of something nobler, of something that's sacred, has been sacred to our great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents, and they fought, and they've died, and they've bled for this country, and we keep that in mind together, and we'll go forward, and it will continue, and it's messy. And as Churchill said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing in the end, usually after they've tried everything else. And I think that even Winston Churchill would be shocked at some of the things we've decided to try in recent years. And yet we will get there. Never forget that America is that shining city on the hill, that example to the world. And there is a set of American ideals that is noble and to which we should all aspire and for which we should all strive. Let's put our shoulders to the wheel and let's commit ourselves to that better day. We can do this together. We really can. Ignore the noise and pay attention to the price of fish. That's what we do in the fish market. For the FarrCast, Harry Jennings, our producer, everybody at Farr, Miller and Washington Hightower Advisors, wish you a great weekend, and we'll be back next week as we try to cover and interpret Wall Street, Washington, and the world. For the FarrCast, I'm Michael Farr. Thanks so much for being with us.
That's it for another episode of the FarrCast. Thanks for being with us, and thanks to our guests Jim Iuorio and Dan Mahaffee. The FarrCast comes to you weekly and is produced by Michael Farr and Harry Jennings and is available for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and all major podcast platforms. We love hearing from you every week, and you can reach us at hjennings@farrmiller.com. Let us know any questions you have and topics you'd like to hear us cover. We would like to remind you that the FarrCast podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or financial advice. The information, statements, comments, views, and opinions expressed or provided in this podcast, including by speakers who are not officers, employees, or agents of Hightower Advisors or Farr, Miller and Washington, are not necessarily those of Hightower Advisors, Farr, Miller and Washington, or any firm any of our guests may represent. Any mention of a specific security should not be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell, and please be aware that past performance is not a guide to the future performance of any security, index, fund, manager, or strategy. We strongly recommend you review with a financial professional before you make any investment decision. And if we can be of assistance at Farr, Miller in Washington, please reach out to me at hjennings@farrmiller.com. We are here to help, and I'll be happy to put any of our listeners in touch with one of our investment professionals for a complimentary review of your portfolio and your investment goals. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Go beyond the headlines each week with the FarrCast. Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Farr, Miller in Washington is a group comprised of investment professionals registered with Hightower Advisors, LLC, and a SEC-registered investment advisor. Some investment professionals may also be registered with Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA and SIPC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC. All information referenced herein is from sources believed to be reliable. Farr, Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC have not independently verified the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this podcast. Farr, Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates make no representations or warranties, expressed or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information or for statements or errors or omissions or results obtained from the use of this information. Farr, Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates assume no liability for any action made or taken in reliance on or relating in any way to the information. This podcast and the materials contained herein were created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed are solely those of the authors and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates. Farr, Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates do not provide tax or legal advice. This material was not intended or written to be used or presented in any way to any entity as tax or legal advice. Clients are urged to consult their tax and/or legal advisors for related questions.